Okay, I think we're ready to get started, Ayush.
All right,
Uh,
let's go.
yeah, so I just wanted to welcome everyone to the beginning of our Masterclass series. We'll be working on topics in emerging tech, which is VR and AR and voice tech, and we'll be running these for every month or so. The purpose of these classes is basically as to share information. So our team has been working in this space for a while now. In fact, our CEO has been doing VR since 1998. I know, right? And we wanted to start sharing some of our learnings during COVID via these master classes. And it's designed basically for anyone interested in learning more about how to the best way to design, build, test the best customer experiences you can make in VR and AR as well as voice tech. Throughout these courses, we'll have experts live from our team spending time at the end of these classes to help you troubleshoot some of your biggest challenges. So if you can see on the control panel to your right, there will be a section, that's the chat section. Please put in all your questions and challenges there, and at the end portion of this course, we'll go over them during a Q&A. And we're really here to help you and your team build even better products, experiences, and generally share what we've learned. So who are we? We're Key Lime Interactive. We are a user experience research and design agency with a sweet spot for emerging tech. On our team, we have strategists, researchers, designers, and thought leaders. And basically what we do as a company is to help you understand who your customers are, how to prioritize improvements and validate your designs, how to differentiate your product, and in general, we do help companies to create a strategy for emerging tech. We've worked with a large amount of enterprise clients from across multiple different industries, from the large tech giants to medical supply companies to gaming studios. And we have with you today two experts. One of them, myself, I'm Marina Roselli. I've been working in the VR and extended reality space from the UX side for a while now. I'll be moderating and helping with the Q&A portion of this masterclass. And with us today, we also have Dr. Ayush Bravagap, who is here with us today. He's worked in VR and the extended reality space and has been published in several journals and conferences, and he'll be our speaker for this masterclass. Just in general, I want to remind you about the chat section on the side of the control panel, and to please save your questions and any of your challenges during them so that I can moderate at the end of the Q&A. And what are you going to get out of this? You'll be learning about advanced topics in self-representation and scale, what it is and how it can make or break your product experiences, and basically how to get it right. And we'll provide you at the end with 6 pro tips for your product team. With that comes a worksheet of tips and resources from this masterclass. And if you see on that same control panel, there is the handout available right there. And I'll also send it to everyone here now. And so with that, I will now hand it over to Ayush.
All right, welcome everybody. My name is Ayush Bhargav, and today I will be taking you through this masterclass on self-representation and scale. So before we dive deeper into this, you're probably wondering, what is self-representation and scale? Why does it matter? How does it actually affect the success of your XR product? Why your team needs to actually nail it from the get-go? Well, let me start by showing you a few examples of why getting this right is a make it or a break it moment. So self-representation matters because it's the difference between enjoyment and frustration. So if you look at the video on the left, you see the famous hole in the wall game where you have to use your body and pose to pass through the wall. On the right, you see the same game represented in VR. But here, you only see your hands as part of your self-representation for a game that uses your whole body. So now you only have cues about your hands and not the body, which can become really frustrating. Self-representation matters because when the stakes are high, there can be devastating consequences for your product. So consider a VR surgical training simulation as you see on the image on the left. As you can see, there are no hands. Now, if you consider the example of a scalpel, it's really important for you to understand how to hold the scalpel. Otherwise, you might actually end up cutting the patient deeper than they should be cut. So in a situation like that, having a hand representation that actually has moving fingers like you see on the bottom right is really important. It actually makes sure that all the skills that you learn in VR are actually transferred to the real world. Scale matters because giving people claustrophobia won't help you sell cars. So if you see this GIF of a interior of a car, you can use something similar to give the person an experience of what buying a car would look like. But if the scale isn't right and the person ends up feeling claustrophobic, their experience is ruined and they might not buy the car, taking away from your business. Scale matters because it can adversely affect emotional perception of your brand experience. So if you consider the simulation of the majestic ancient Egypt, you'll see that the Sphinx is not of the right scale. So having a simulation like that and not having the correct scale takes away from the experience of the whole majestic ancient Egyptian culture lifestyle. And you definitely don't want that for your participants to experience that and not have the full emotional range of things. So it kind of defeats the whole purpose of the simulation. So as I go through this masterclass, I would really want you to think about how self-representation and scale can be adversely affecting the user experience in your particular product. So self-representation is an interactive or social representation of a user. They're also referred to as self-avatars. Now, any graphical artifact that represents a part of your body or your full body, or maybe just the controllers that you're playing around in VR with, is a self-representation or a self-avatar. Now, self-avatars are actually part of the fun in VR. You get to be who you want. You could be a robot with a cat head, you could be an alien, you could be a skeleton. And they also improve presence and immersion. They make you feel like you're actually part of the environment and not just, some random person in the middle of an ocean, maybe. So they're also really easy to mess up. So if you consider this example where you have a full body which actually moves with your own movements, that's really awesome and adds immersion. But you only have partial hands. And in this particular example, it kind of looks painful as well because now you can see the guitar go through your left hand. So suddenly this whole beautiful simulation feels gimmicky and breaks immersion, which is something you definitely want to keep your participants away from. You want them to have an excellent experience. So let's dig a little deeper into the virtual hand research. So Lujikis et al. Recently studied how having different hand representation affects the performance of tasks. So they either use a sphere, a controller, or a hand representation. Now, the task was really simple. All participants had to do was pick up an object from the table and drop it in the bin on the right. But they saw that participants who had a sphere as a representation for their hand performed much worse than people who actually had the controller or the hand models. Now, self-avatars actually give you a lot more than that. So self-avatars also tell you about affordances. Affordances are cues that hint at actions we can perform in a particular environment. And they tell you what affordances you can engage in based on how big your body is, what your strength is, etc., etc. So consider yourself, you can probably get through a regular sized door, but you probably can't through a doggy door. Or consider your strength. So you may be able to make a free throw, but making a three-pointer is actually much more difficult. So having a self-representation actually tells you what affordances you can engage in. So consider this study by Lin et al. In 2013, who looked at the affordance judgments of stepping off of a ledge in the presence versus absence of an avatar. So the authors saw that when they gave participants an avatar, their judgment of stepping off of a ledge was much more realistic. Participants thought that they could realistically step off at highest level, which was 25% of their eye height. So as you can imagine, if you consider this example of the scalpel again, having a hand with moving fingers affords that you can actually pick up the object in different ways. So having a hand like that will make sure that the person who's training in VR for surgery actually understands how to hold a scalpel and understands how to do that in the real world as well. So once you get all these things together and you have a self-representation for your simulation, how do you know that you're actually getting it right? Well, there are several different metrics that you can use to measure that, and there are several different ways you can measure those metrics. So one of the most important metrics is body ownership. It answers the question, does the representation feel like it's actually mine? Is it actually moving with my body? Is the movement of the self-representation affected by my own movements? The other is presence. Does the representation that I have make me feel like I'm actually part of the environment, as we talked earlier? Then there's agency. Do my actions and the avatar that is moved based on my actions affect the events that are happening around me? So is touching an object actually making the object fall over or move or not? Then there's usability. This is one of the most common metrics we measure in VR, but it actually tells you if the representation that you're using is actually helping you effectively complete the task at hand or not. You can obviously measure all of these using surveys, and there's various surveys out there like the SUS, the Avatar Embodiment Questionnaire. But you can also measure these as part of the post-experience debrief or interviews. You can ask probing question to participants, ask them how they felt, etc., etc. You can also use simulation data, which is much more objective. So you can see how quickly they're completing a task or if they're engaging with other things based on physics, etc., etc. So, but self-representations are only part of the equation. For a virtual environment to feel realistic and for people to have a really good experience, they need to have an accurate sense of scale in the environment. Now, a sense of scale comes from the perception of spatial properties like size, distance, and volume. So virtual environment scale needs to be truthful for users to act like they do in the real world. Since the purpose of a VR simulation is to either, produce or elicit the same kind of effects as regular human behavior. But in VR, we've seen in terms of research that size and distance is often under or overestimated. So as part of my own research, I looked at the affordance judgments of passability. So what we did was we had a real world door, which is the image on the top, and we created a virtual replica of the same door in VR in the exact same scale. And we saw that participants in VR actually needed the same size door to be slightly larger to be perceived as passable. And we also looked at the behavior behind making such affordance judgments. So we saw that participants in VR needed to observe the door from a much closer distance as compared to the real world to have the same level of accuracy when it comes to passing through different sized doorways. Now, self-avatars also affect scale. So Panaku et al. In 2013 looked at the effects of having different avatar appearance on the estimation of size. So they had participants embody a child avatar or an adult avatar that was the same size in terms of height as the child avatar. And interestingly, what they saw was that participants who embodied the actual child avatar overestimated the size of objects more than the participants who embodied the adult avatar but with the same height as the child avatar. So this kind of tells you that it's not just the height, but also the actual appearance of the avatar that affects your perception of the scale in the environment itself. So there are various different visual cues that you can use to enhance spatial perception in VR. So for example, shadows. Shadows tell you a lot. Shadows tell you where the object is, where the light is, etc., etc. And then there's occlusion. Occlusion simply means that an object that's behind another object is actually partially occluded. You only see part of it, or maybe none of it. Then there's perspective. Things closer look bigger, things farther away look much smaller. And then there's parallax. So things that are farther away in the background look a lot or move a lot less slower as compared to things in the front. And then there's texture gradient. So, if you have texture on an object that's close to you, you'll probably be seeing a lot of the texture, but as the object moves away, the texture seems to start blurring away. So you can see a lot of these visual cues in the image that I have on here. So you can see that, it's much darker in the back. The objects in the back are moving slower than the objects in the front. There's lots of shadows and lights. So it gives you a really good impression of how big this environment is, where things are, which objects are behind which ones, etc., etc. But there's also other factors that can affect the perception of scale. So screen resolution and refresh rate are something that's not always in your control, but you should always use something that is high definition or gives you a good refresh rate, because even a slight difference in the refresh rate is perceptible to human eyes, and you can actually lose a lot of users just because it's not the right thing. So Field of view is another thing that you can actually somewhat control. So as you can see in the image on the top, it's the same environment, but from a 40-degree field of view versus a 150-degree field of view. So you can see the 40-degree field of view seems to have objects that are much bigger as compared to the one in the 150-degree field of view. So you always want to make sure that the field of view you're using for the visuals matches that of the HMD to give a realistic effect. Then there's eye height. So eye height in VR simply means the vantage point that the person is using to look at the environment. So matching the person's eye height to his actual height actually does a lot more than you think. So if you consider the image on the bottom, you see that it's the same point in the same environment looking at a car, but at 3 different eye heights. So at a shorter eye height, at a matched eye height, and taller eye height. So in the shorter eye height, you can see the car looks a lot bigger than the car in the taller eye height condition. So when you're making simulations, make sure that you're matching the eye height of the person to in the VR simulation as well. Sometimes they might be sitting, so it depends on the interaction also. If they're sitting, but they need to look at like maybe an ocean or something, the height might not matter as much. So how do you evaluate the scale? So as I mentioned earlier, it's VR, the underestimation and overestimation of object distance and size is very perceptible in VR. So just modeling the right sized objects is not enough. You need to perceptually evaluate it. So there are several different methods to do that. One is to actually use units. So what you do is you have the participant, view the object or the distance, and then you ask them in actual units how far or how big it is. Then there's gesture-based estimates. So once you show the participant the object, you simply ask them to stick their hands out and tell you how wide it is with their hands, and then you can just measure the distance between your hands. Then there's blind walking, which is used mostly for distance estimations. But what you do is you show the participant a target, and then you ask them to close their eyes and walk to that target. So depending on if they overshoot or undershoot the target, you can tell what their perception of distance is. And then there's affordance judgment. So like we discussed earlier, affordance judgments could be of anything like passing through, stepping over, jumping, etc., etc. But these are most accurate because they make you think in the way we actually do in the real world. So the most important in all of these things is to have the baseline that you're going to use to compare. So if you're using something like verbal estimates or gesture-based estimates, you want to make sure that you're using the actual size of the object. Or for something like blind walking and affordance judgments, you want to use the real world counterpart. So create a similar situation in the real world and record the behavior in that and compare your VR judgments to those real world judgments. So with that, here are 6 key takeaways to consider when implementing self-representation and scale. So think about what the self-representation needs to convey and how it will affect the task completion. So, if your self-representation just needs to convey where the objects are, does it actually need to convey how to hold the objects themselves? Self-representations can be complex. You can use inverse kinematics to get a lot of this done, but they can still look finicky. So if you are going to consider a simpler version, consider what the trade-off would be. If having a full body actually affects how people interact with the stimulation, or will just the upper body do? Evaluate your self-avatar by using usability and performance. See if the avatar is helping participants complete the task at hand. Or consider the importance of scale in your experience. If you're building something for recreation and fun, scale might not be as important. But if you're doing something like a real estate VR simulation, having your participant understand the size of the sitch or space itself is going to be extremely important. And use as many cues as possible. They don't need to be high definition or highly realistic, but just having them in the right places is going to give them a lot of perceptual scale, spatial properties. Number 6, perceptually evaluate the environment scale. Like I just explained, it's really important to perceptually evaluate it. So use affordance judgments as much as you can. Otherwise, you can resort to something like the verbal estimates or blind walking. And with that, I will take any questions that you guys have.
That was really great, Ayush. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so with our first question, some of the attendees have mentioned things around having a product already, and questions around how to prioritize. So what would you say to help a team that doesn't want to completely overhaul their product or drastically change it? Which factors in scale and self-representation should they look into first?
So it depends. You can definitely start with usability scores. So usability scores, both qualitative and quantitative measures, will tell you a lot about what users think about the scale of the environment and the representation that you have. So you definitely should start there, and that will help you understand what is more important and how that should be altered.
Got it. Cool. And so we had a few questions around spatial perception, particularly with eye height. What are the different, and you mentioned in when you were going through that section, sitting and standing experiences, and I was wondering what are the different considerations you might have in mind when designing or testing for those two, especially if it's within the same product?
Sure. So one thing you can definitely, like I said before, is perceptually evaluate the size. And it also depends on your simulation. So if it's a simulation that just requires, exploring the environment, just moving the head around for something like stargazing, you probably don't need to focus a lot on the height. So somebody's just sitting down or laying on the bed or standing, it doesn't really matter. But if you are, sitting down and actually moving in the environment through a space, trying to maneuver around things, then it's definitely important for the person to know how big the space is, how small the gap is, if they can actually go through or not. So in that case, it's really important to, evaluate the height of the person that you're giving them in VR.
Got it. And would you recommend a way to do that for sitting, for example, or?
So with sitting, again, the traveling metaphor and the interaction matters, but again, it depends on what the purpose of the simulation itself is. And again, usability scores will definitely tell you a lot about that as well.
Yeah. So it comes down a lot to the usability scores then.
Definitely.
Cool. And another question here. So in the midst of COVID, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about and trying to evaluate how to use collaboration and prototyping tools remotely. So how would you say self-representation affects how users perceive and interact with each other in virtual environments?
That's an excellent question. And the thing with self-representation, self-avatar is that they actually do affect how people look at each other, especially in social VR. And there's a whole different concept called the Proteus effect that's behind it. So it basically says that depending on the avatar that you take on, it can actually affect your personality in the virtual space. And there's a lot of research that has been done behind it as well. So there's this fun research where participants were either a superhero or a regular human, and then after the experience, what the experimenter would do is purposely knock over a can of pens, and participants who were a superhero in the simulation before this happened, they would actually help the experimenter pick up the pens, whereas people who were not did not do that. So it's really interesting. So definitely, if you're going for a conference meeting, definitely make sure that your avatar is either similar to everybody else around you, or if it's going to be super professional, maybe create your own avatar that actually gives you a suit or something.
Got it. So how we're seeing each other as well as ourselves in the environment can affect our behaviors then.
So like I just mentioned, one of the things is affordances. You can, definitely based on the avatar you have different affordances in the environment. And if you're trying to make a sales pitch, if you're dressed up as a superhero, people might not take you as seriously as they would if you were, maybe using a simpler avatar or maybe wearing a suit as an avatar. And considering that we're confined to our homes right now, this seems to be the business area these days. So definitely making sure that you are dressing your avatar appropriately for the event is important.
Got it. Well, thank you for that. I don't think I see any other questions, but if you could go to the next slide, I would like to introduce to everybody our email, mtech@KeyLime Interactive. So basically, if you have any other burning questions, please send them along to us. We're really happy to problem solve with any of you. And thank you so much for joining us on this masterclass. We really hope this was helpful for you and your products. And we'll be having more masterclasses coming up, as I mentioned, every month or so. So towards the end of June, we'll have another one that you can see here that is around other things that your product team needs to nail from the get-go. And be on the lookout for the email and the save the date.
All right, great. It was great conducting this seminar. We'll see you next time. All right, see ya.
And thank you again, Ayush. You did a great job.